Bonjour distingués invités, chers collègues, participants et participantes de tout partout au Canada et des quatre coins du monde. Bienvenue à cette impressionnante conférence sur les politiques scientifiques canadiennes. It is an honor to welcome you to the University of Ottawa's plenary session on emission-driven research and innovation. My name is Sylvain Charbonneau, and I'm the Vice President Research and Innovation at the University. Avant d'entamer cette discussion, j'aimerais tout d'abord prendre quelques minutes pour rendre hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre où se situe l'Université d'Ottawa. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure jusqu'à ce jour non cédé. Respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. The University of Ottawa is proud to be partner of Canada's largest science and innovation policy forum. Our collaboration with the Canadian Science Policy Centre has been growing steadily over the past few years, and we are honored that its president and CEO, Dr. Madrad Hariri, has chosen to share his expertise with us as a senior fellow of the university's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, which organized this plenary session. À de nombreux égards, le thème de cette conférence, Bâtir un avenir meilleur, concorde parfaitement avec le plan stratégique de l'Université d'Ottawa. Selon la CSPC, la clé pour bâtir un avenir meilleur est l'inclusion, ce qui sous-tend également les objectifs de l'Université d'Ottawa d'être plus agile et plus interconnectée, entre autres. Sur un plan plus global, cela témoigne de la convergence des objectifs des divers acteurs en politique scientifique. An inclusive cross-sectorial approach is equally fundamental to mission-driven research and innovation, which has gained in popularity in recent years. It starts with identifying a big goal to address a complex problem facing humanity, followed by building a research agenda and a coalition of partners to help achieve that goal. There is perhaps no greater example of mission-driven research in action than the mobilization of researchers around the world to find solutions to COVID-19 and its widespread repercussion on our society. As you will see in today's plenary, the University of Ottawa has great strength in mission-driven research in areas such as climate change and sustainability, as well as social innovation. Its fortunate location in the heart of Canada's capital, with its proximity to the seat of government and international organization, make it perfectly positioned to be a leader in this field. Pas moins de la moitié de nos 24 centres et instituts de recherche se concentrent à la recherche en politique publique. Notre institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique, par exemple, est un véhicule de collaboration en recherche sans pareil, qui rassemble les secteurs universitaires publics, privés et civils pour aborder de grands défis sociétaux. La professeure Monica Gattinger, qui dirige cet institut d'une main de maître depuis plusieurs années, sera la modératrice de cette séance plénière. Sans plus tarder, je lui donne la parole en vous souhaitant à toutes et à tous une discussion heureuse.
Merci, Sylvain. Thank you so much for those stimulating opening words and for the land acknowledgement. I, too, am joining from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. So we're just delighted to have all of you with us this afternoon. For those who aren't familiar with the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, as Sylvain mentioned, it's one of many research centers at the University of Ottawa. We're a cross-faculty research institute that explores the links between science, society, and policy. And we've just come through a very extensive process to develop our forthcoming 5-year strategic plan. That strategic plan has the following vision. It's very ambitious, which is to help Canada to transform decision-making for the grand challenges of our time. And for us, what that means is really helping to strengthen the links between researchers, with business, with government, with civil society. So this session for us is very much dans nos cordes et nos intérêts de recherche pour les années qui viennent. We're delighted to have you with us. So in terms of this session, we have a format as follows. We're going to begin the session with a presentation about mission-driven research and innovation that's going to be delivered by Dr. Jeffrey Kinder, who is at the Institute on Governance as their executive director of their innovation and science activities. Jeff is also a senior fellow at the ISSP and my co-conspirator in organizing this panel. So thank you very much to Jeff. And then we're going to move into responses, brief responses from a number of different perspectives. And I will be presenting each of those perspectives to you briefly when we get to that portion of the panel, to give folks an idea of, different approaches or different thoughts or responses to mission-driven research and innovation. Then we'll move to a moderated discussion with our panelists, and then to a Q&A with the audience. So we're really looking forward to your engagement. We wanted to get started by engaging people right at the outset, right from the top. So we do have a live poll, and I think I see that it was already made live. So I think people are already answering it or have already begun to answer it. If you have not yet done so, please make your way to answering it rapidly. But what I think we can see here, if you look at the question, so that we wanted to begin by asking people, what is your level of familiarity with mission-driven research? And I think it's very interesting to see these results that very few people answered that they are extremely familiar with it. And, I love the I could be on this panel as the subtitle of that. Most people are somewhere in the middle is what we're seeing here. They're very familiar or they're somewhere familiar. And this for us is part of why we wanted Jeff to give this presentation to get us started in terms of getting everyone on the same page around mission-driven research. So we had a second poll question that we can end that one, bring the other one up. We had a second poll question, which I think some of you have already started to answer. If you have not yet had the occasion to answer it, please do so quickly. And we wanted to ask, and this came up in our discussions for the preparation of this panel. Very quickly, we got into discussions around, does mission-driven research come at the expense of curiosity or so-called basic research? And so we wanted to ask where you stand on that question. And I think what we're seeing here is that the vast majority of people are saying not necessarily. And I guess the question then becomes, okay, so what makes for not necessarily? So thank you very much for answering those poll questions. We're going to have another couple questions for you once we move into the moderated portion of the panel. But for now, it gives me great pleasure to bring to the stage Jeff Kinder to give you a presentation around mission-driven research and innovation. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Monica. And are we good to go with the slides? All right, thank you very much. So welcome everyone, and I want to give a shout out and a happy Thanksgiving to our American colleagues. I also want to acknowledge that I am joining you from the Institute on Governance. We're located here in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So thank you, Monica. Thank you both for including me in this panel, and as a fellow in your institute. It's been a wonderful collaboration, and hopefully will continue for quite a while. I also want to thank our panelists. I think we've got a stellar lineup, so very eager to hear what they have to say. And I also want to acknowledge that my thoughts and my presentation today have been informed by some work that we've been doing at the IOG with some federal departments and agencies over the last year or so, under the broad umbrella of rethinking the social contract between science, society, and innovation. And in particular, I want to acknowledge the work of a research associate, Patrick Galvin, who's done a lot of the research and thinking that we've done on mission-based research. So thank you, Patrick. All right, let's get into it. So why missions? Well, so actually, before I get into missions per se, I think it's important to understand that broader context that shapes our national science and innovation system. So if we think back to coming out of World War II, there was an implicit social contract that was put forward by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the science advisor to President Roosevelt at the time, in a famous report called Science: The Endless Frontier. In there, he laid out an implicit social contract that suggested that society should continue to fund science in peacetime in exchange for the benefits that would flow back to society from science in the form of new knowledge, new innovations, new technologies. Importantly, he argued that autonomy would be very important for that relationship, in the sense of society yielding a high degree of autonomy to the scientific community to make decisions around what should be funded, what should count as research evidence, etc. And in fact, he famously said that science best advances through the free play of free intellects working on subjects of their choice. And that social contract then has informed the thinking not only of the US system, but in Canada and around the world as this social contract idea got promulgated through the OECD and other means. But as the slide says here, serendipity is not a strategy. I think 75 years on, the context has shifted quite a bit, and I think there's growing recognition that we need to rethink the contract. In fact, even the notion of a contract perhaps needs to be rethought, because it does tend to perpetuate this notion that science and society are two parties that are potentially in opposition, rather than understanding that scientists are, of course, part of society. And so, whether it's a new contract or some other new sort of framing metaphor, the idea is we need to consider how to create the greatest possible compatibility between the new knowledge that scientists create, on the one hand, and the public's capacity to assimilate it for society's long term benefit, on the other hand. And of course, this is not just my own thinking, but I think there's growing recognition that we're at a turning point. Dare I say turning point, since that's the title of a report that was just issued this morning by CCA. But here in this quote, we see for the president of the U.S. National Academies of Science and a president of Arizona State University, a major research university in the U.S., saying that while the post-World War II model for organizing science remains powerful, moving beyond its limits will be necessary for assuring that the contributions of science continue to solve a wide array of societal challenges. So there's this growing conversation that missions are a part of. Now, having said that, missions have a long history. We can think back to the British government's support of the Longitude Prize to solve the longitude problem. We have the Manhattan Project, obviously, the Apollo program for the lunar landing, but also not just in sort of physical science and engineering spaces, but also in the life sciences. We've had the War on Cancer, the Human Genome Project, and even within this small list, which is not exhaustive, we see that there can be quite a variation in terms of the size of the mission, in terms of the discipline focus, etc. So there's a great deal of variety in the long history of missions. Coming up to today and the current efforts, this is again just a small sampling of some of the current efforts that are informing this discussion about missions. We have the X Prize, and we'll hear more about that from Marcus. The European Commission has launched 5 missions in areas of food, cancer, oceans, smart cities, and climate change adaptation. And we have the High Bar Research Alliance, which is advancing highly integrative, basic, and responsive research. And I'll come back to this later in my presentation in terms of what missions mean for basic research versus applied research. And again, this is not exhaustive. We can also point to Japan, which now has a moonshot program. The UK is setting up ARIA, the Advanced Research and Innovation Agency. Germany has a federal agency for disruptive innovation. And the US continues to add to its alphabet soup of ARPA agencies, most recently with ARPA-H for health, recently announced by the Biden administration. And then, of course, in Canada, we can also point to other examples, the IDEAS program at National Defence, Ag Canada's Living Labs, and various programs at ICED and Innovation Canada, including the superclusters. I think all of these are experiments. They're not all necessarily mission programs per se, but they all contribute to this overall conversation. Now, of course, much of the current conversation about missions is being, I would say, championed by the economist Mariana Mazzucato. In particular, two books of hers are particularly important in this conversation. The first from 2013 was The Entrepreneurial State, in which she, I think, largely debunked a lot of the public versus private sector myths about innovation. And she made a compelling case for the role of the public sector as an important driver of innovation, not just in the instances of market failure. And then her more recent book focuses explicitly on missions, drawing heavily on the Apollo moonshot program. So, how does she think about mission-based innovation? I think importantly, she calls for a mission-based economy, or an innovation economy that uses policy to co-shape and co-create markets. Again, rather than seeing the government's role as only as fixing market failures. Catalyzing investment, innovation, and collaboration across a wide variety of actors. And this is important because too often I think missions get a bad reputation of being sort of a government top-down, very heavy top-down approach, when in fact it has to be very much a cross-sectoral approach. And if you think back to the Apollo program, that program engaged something like 400,000 people, but less than 10% of those actually worked at NASA. Hundreds of businesses, small, medium, and large, were mobilized through that program, and so it was very much a multi-sectoral program. It's also important that a mission-based approach use a variety of policy instruments, that they focus on outcomes, and that they foster bottom-up experimentation and risk-taking. We're going to need new governance models, and of course, here at the Institute on Governance, we spend a lot of time thinking about those. And I think this last one is very key. Taking a mission-based approach requires embracing a sense of urgency, and I think that's particularly apropos, obviously, with grand challenges such as climate change. This is a graphic that Mazzucato uses in her latest book. She talks about the difference between a grand challenge and a mission. So something like climate change is obviously a grand challenge, to which actually a number of missions can address the grand challenge. So this diagram shows one sort of a one-to-one relationship between a mission and a grand challenge, but actually you can have multiple missions. It again stresses this notion that we need cross-sectoral innovation, and I think we'll hear more about this aspect from Brenda later on. And then a whole portfolio of projects that allow for bottom-up experimentation is key. In the latest book, she does very much focus on the Apollo program as sort of a case study. She points to some of the success factors. Clearly, leadership, having a charismatic president who made this a clear goal of his administration with Kennedy was important. Setting a clear, ambitious goal, with ample funding and an urgent timeline, and again catalyzing innovation and collaboration across many sectors. But it's also fair to point out that the Apollo program was largely a technical mission within a Cold War context, and so that perhaps shapes some of its success. And the question then becomes, how do we adapt that to our current situation? Are we able to adapt some of these principles to the problems that we're facing today? And some people now are talking not about moonshots, but about earthshots. So some of these challenges, again, to reiterate, it's one thing to have a highly technical mission, but the wicked problems that we're dealing with today are obviously deeply societal, and lots of entanglements, lots of complexity. Are we able to adapt the mission-based approach to these more wicked problems that we're facing today, such as climate change, global poverty, and also reconciliation? And in this context, we'll hear more from Jessica in terms of the appropriate interweaving of science, indigenous knowledge, and different ways of knowing. There's also still not a lot of literature out there in terms of how do you actually implement a mission-based approach. I was hoping her latest book would go into this more than it does. She does point to what the EC's doing with their 5 missions, but they're still quite early days, and we don't yet have systematic analysis of the outcomes of those. So we're still, I mean, I think it's still fair to say that we're still sort of feeling our way in terms of how do you actually implement these in the current context. And then, of course, the post-truth, post-trust era that we're living through, rise of populism, hyperpartisanship. I think it's going to make it very difficult to build the types of consensus that we'll need for multi-year missions. That's going to be a huge challenge going forward, and something we'll have to grapple with. So in the couple minutes that I have left, I do want to just sort of at least initially explore this whole question of what do missions mean for basic research. There was the poll question that showed that most of you feel that missions don't necessarily impact negatively on basic research, but I think we need to explore this head on because this is it is a concern that you often hear. And I think Reese will be diving into this issue as well in his remarks. So I just want to spend a couple minutes exploring this a little bit because I think it's core to the mission-based approach. So if we start with kind of the natural or the traditional continuum between basic research and applied research, and yes, I know there are those out there who say that this is a completely false dichotomy. We should just do away with this this whole notion. But bear with me for a minute. If we start with that, then what often happens is people will say, well, a mission-directed approach is very much aligned with applied research, and basic research is very much undirected or non-directed. And I think that's actually not quite right. I would suggest that those two notions are actually orthogonal, and that creates a bit of a 4-quadrant space that we can explore. So obviously in the lower left quadrant, you do have sort of the traditional non-directed basic research, curiosity-based, very pure, what we often call fundamental research. In the opposite quadrant, we would have more directed, applied research, very much geared towards solving a particular problem. And in that sense, most people would agree that these are the typical categories. But I think, 25 years ago now, Donald Stokes famously pointed out that there's such a thing as a Pasteur's quadrant that is a bit more directed. It's basic research, but it's use inspired. He pointed to Louis Pasteur's work, which was motivated by a desire to avoid food spoilage, but also made major, fundamental contributions to microbiology. So most people now have, signed on to the notion that there is this third quadrant, and then that leaves this quadrant in the lower right, which is perhaps a bit counterintuitive. The notion that you could have non-directed applied research, and so hold that thought. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So then this creates the space that I think we can use to sort of map the major funding programs that we have. Now, this is not exhaustive. I'm definitely looking primarily at the federal level programs, and so obviously it excludes provincial and other levels of programming. It also, I mean, we could definitely quibble over the exact placement of any of these bubbles, but I think generally people would agree that we have a number of programs that sort of span the space from the Granting Council Insights and Discovery grants, which are very much in that lower left curiosity-based pure basic research quadrant, to things like the superclusters and Strategic Innovation Fund, which are much more in the upper right quadrant of directed applied research. And so let me come back to now this question of, well, what is non-directed applied research? Well, I'm gonna suggest that SHRED is in that quadrant, the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit Program. Obviously, within a firm, if they're doing applied research that qualifies for SHRED, it will be directed towards whatever problem they're trying to solve or whatever product or innovation they're trying to develop. But from a government policy point of view, SHRED has always been positioned as a broad framework program that's provides indirect support. There's no I mean, as long as the research is eligible for SHRED, there's no sort of top-down direction or mission focus. And so in that sense, SHRED is in that quadrant of supporting non-directed applied research. And of course, what I would like to suggest then is at the top of this space, there is an opportunity space for more mission-directed research and innovation. Importantly, I think that spans both the upper left and the upper right quadrants. So it would be mission-directed, but supporting both sort of Pasteur's quadrant basic research as well as more mission-driven applied research. Now, a key question, of course, is how do we fund this? Well, the government has obviously in its election campaign recently called for a CARPA, a Canadian Advanced Research Projects Agency, modeled after the US DARPA and sister agencies. And so there is obviously some anticipation that this organization will be set up and funded appropriately, and potentially to provide mission-based funding in both the Pasteur's quadrant and the mission-driven applied quadrant. But I would also perhaps provocatively suggest that we could rethink the SHRED program. We've seen the business R&D continue to decline for decades, despite having a generous tax credit program. Perhaps it's time for us to sort of rethink SHRED. And in principle, we could redirect the $3 billion that we annually forego in revenues due to the tax credits. We could redirect that to mission-directed approach without even touching the pure basic research support of the granting councils. And so, I end with the question of a little play on words with carpe diem. Is it time for Canada to seize the day, go big or go home, think about missions? And with that, I will turn it back over to Monica.
Terrific, Jeff. That was phenomenal. We've already got people in the discussion forum asking if they can get their hands on your presentation. I think this is going to be a pretty hot document. You did a really tremendous job, I think, of laying out the what of mission-driven research, but also some of the challenges and tensions. Issues that arise for the research community, issues that arise for governments in terms of their choices, some of the potential challenges or tensions from a societal or a political perspective. And that's why we brought together a set of respondents who could speak to those variety of issues. So we have 4 respondents now. We're going to hear from each of them in turn. And we invited each of them to give, kind of a different lens or a different perspective on the issues. So our first respondent is Dr. Rhys Cosson. Rhys is a colleague of mine at the University of Ottawa. He's a full professor and university research chair in experimental evolution at the University of Ottawa's Department of Biology. He's also a core member at the ISSP and is somebody who has worked not only domestically but also internationally around certainly mission-driven research, but also in terms of science diplomacy and building the next generation of scientists. So, Rhys, you often say in conversations where you and I have been on panels together, you say, well, I'm just a scientist, bringing a science perspective on this. That's, I think, what we're really keen to hear from you about today. What does this mean for, individual scientists? What's your sense of, of mission-driven research and innovation, some of the opportunities and challenges? Rhys, over to you.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you for being here at this discussion. Thanks to Monica and Jeff for the invitation. I'm also the land acknowledgement previously stated also applies. I have sort of 3, and one actually speaks very directly to Jeff's 4 quadrants because that and when I talk about early career researchers, especially. Number 1 is let's not forget the value of basic research, however described. Basic research has actually helped us get through this pandemic incredibly, in an incredible way, whether it's vaccine development or I'll speak from my point position that everything we've learned about this virus and the pandemic and how it spilled over from animals into humans, and then the various variants of concern we have been confronting, is exactly the sort of which is basically a basic research lab, studying the genetics and ecology of adaptation, very Darwin-esque questions. That's what we're seeing playing out around the world is exactly what we've been seeing playing out in our test tubes in the lab, where we do experiments watching evolution happen in real time. A lot of those principles that really are focused, in my case, around trying to answer questions about the origins of biodiversity, all of a sudden become really important in confronting the coronavirus and our understanding and how to deal with that. So let's not forget about it, but let's also I would support the idea of dichotomy here, and I would argue that in relation to your quadrant approach, that most researchers, no matter who they are, would probably, at least academic researchers based at universities in Canada, probably put themselves in the use-inspired category, right? Almost all of us at one point or another start thinking about a problem because of to deal with. A few years ago, I was started to think about antimicrobial resistance and how it spreads around a city. And that led me to thinking about, well, do we have good models for how beneficial mutations, which is in this case what any mutation is, how that spreads around in space? And it turns out that we actually didn't. And it's inspired a whole new line of research in my life. Let's not assume that all researchers based at universities just want to be left alone or have no interest in contributing. We absolutely do. The other thing I'd point out from an international perspective, and Jeff, if you can put up that first slide of mine, I've been sitting for the past year with a group planning forums, Global Future Council on Scientific Collaboration, and we've done a little bit of analysis on the sort of barriers and of collaboration internationally. I want to just focus your attention on the left side here. Don't forget about international collaboration. This the left shows you the percent of publications that have international co-authors on the y-axis against expenditure in a country as a percent of GDP. And you'll note a negative trend, and that's a real statistical signal. I've noted and my takeaway from this, just for what it's worth, is that the more you invest, the more R&D domestically, obviously, the less focus there is on international. That's not always true. There's a lot of variation around there. That trend line, but it's interesting that a lot of what we need for grant to address these missions that are grand challenges that are international in scope, deliberately, it can't be done just by focusing on domestic R&D expenditures only. You can't do it. Don't forget about the basic research, and don't forget that we live in a global world, and tackling these problems really requires deliberate attention to them. It's the issue of rallying the community, and I think that there, Jeff, you laid out really well the importance of vision and urgency. Trust component, and you can look to the right-hand side where we've gathered together some data on from what's called the World Values Survey. You can see the which basically is a survey that's been conducted over the last 20 years or so. Questioners go around to countries around about 80 countries around the world and ask about 1,000 respondents to answer a series of questions. In this case, the question was, can trusted? And what you're seeing on the x-axis is the percent that respond completely or somewhat. And clearly, when you plot that against the amount of partnerships as a percent of total publications, you see a positive relationship. Underscores the importance of trust. And you can flip to the next slide, Jeff, to drive home this point. I've now changed the to be biggest mission that we're dealing with right now, which is progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. This is data coming from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Jeff Sachs' group. and it's basically taking all 17 goals and trying to figure out how much progress has been made toward progress. Again, R&D expenditure and trust on the x-axis, and you can see a positive relationship there. So the good part of invest in R&D, the more likely you are to make progress towards the SDGs. And don't forget that when it comes to this particular mission, which is probably the biggest that we're facing, important role. So I just thought it'd be useful to have a little bit of data there. That I want to mention is the importance of collaboration and cooperation. Whether it's scientists and engineering working with healthcare workers or with social scientists and humanities, as well as early career researchers, this is absolutely working outside the academy with partner organizations. And the idea of a co-laboratory co-creation is really important. I think it's not enough to and funding agencies say, this is what we think we want to do, and throw some money at research. Good at research into grant proposals, try and convince others that that's what they want. But it's really the conflict between the researchers and the rest of the world, or at least the funding world in that case, where we're all kind of trying to pull one over on each other. Sometimes it kind of feels like the funding agencies want to catalyze missions or research into particular areas, and the researchers want to do their research. There is a sweet spot in section, and there's a real opportunity to brainstorm around funding models and research support that catalyzes that. And I think co-creation is really a key component of that. And I'll end there and pass it back to Monica.
Rhys, thanks so much for that. Lots packed in there for us to unpack as we move forward with the session. But I really like the way in which you brought forward this sort of the non-economic, non-policy instrument, as it were, elements of this collaboration, trust, some of the cooperation, and I think the word that really comes to my mind is alignment. Right? What do we need to do to try to get some better alignment on some of these issues when it comes to mission-driven research? So the next panelist, the next respondent, we wanted to ask somebody from civil society to give us a perspective on mission-driven research and innovation. And we kind of racked our brains a little bit on this about who would be or what kind of perspective would be the most sort of valuable. And we're so delighted that the name we came up with was a person who agreed to participate in the session. And it's Jessica Parrott, who is Section Manager of Indigenous Knowledge and Reconciliation at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So if there ever was a mission for the nuclear sector, it's nuclear waste and the long-term disposal of nuclear waste. And the NWMO, full disclosure, I serve on the Scientific Advisory Council for the NWMO, is doing some absolutely exceptional cutting edge work in terms of not only the scientific and engineering innovation that's required, but also doing this in co-creation with Indigenous communities, with local communities, very, showing a tremendous amount of leadership around reconciliation. So we are so pleased that Jessica has agreed to lend her perspective to this session. And I would also like to thank Jessica for smudging us in to this session in the pre-panel session before we began today. So Jessica, we're really looking forward to your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Monica, for such a kind introduction. And I'd just like to say thank you for having me on the panel. It's a real honor and pleasure to participate in the conversation and dialogue. What I would like to talk a bit about, because sometimes I think there is this misconception or drive on the inclusion of Indigenous voice and Indigenous knowledge that gets stuck in this bucket of kind of a social aspect of a project. And what I would like to break down and bring to the conversation is how we need to understand that Indigenous voice is important in all mission-driven projects, especially in how we're co-creating it. And that if we make that space for Indigenous voice within how we're creating missions, I think that does broadly serve society as a whole and the economy as a whole. But in doing that, we also have to create space for Indigenous knowledge. And my work is really to kind of be that bridge between Western way of knowing and Indigenous way of knowing, and how we can build that bridge together to really ultimately make our projects better projects. And one thing I've come to learn is breaking down this misconception of what Indigenous knowledge is. And Indigenous knowledge is, oftentimes seen as, knowledge of the land, where people, pick medicines, or where the blueberries are growing, where the moose are migrating. When in fact, Indigenous knowledge is a very rich and sophisticated knowledge system that is also inclusive of governance. It's also inclusive of research and science. And by, creating that space for voice, we have to make sure that Indigenous knowledge is part of that space. And in doing so, we can co-create these projects that is inclusive of Indigenous research, Indigenous science. And when we think about these missions right now that we had heard about around sustainability as being a real, issue of the day, Indigenous knowledge is, the DNA of that is sustainability. When we think about things like 7th-generation thinking, when we think of principles like reciprocity, relationship, and respect, when we think about original treaties like the dish with one spoon, those are founded on sustainability. And within Indigenous way of knowing, this holistic way of thinking, things like capitalism, economy, governance, good governance, research, environmental stewardship, science, they all work together to really drive the mission forward. And it really is leaning on all those things together as a cohesive unit to make sure that our mission is achieved through Indigenous way of knowing. And I use an example of something like the canoe. So the canoe is an Anishinaabe invention. The Anishinaabe people invented the canoe. And when we think about the canoe, let's think about first the structure of it, the materials engineering that's required to construct that canoe, the mathematics, the engineering that goes into building that canoe to make sure that it can float on the water, that it can also transport people thousands of kilometers for trading. How that trading then benefits the community. How bringing, making those trips and bringing stuff back is also creating good governance, because we're learning, we're interacting with people, we are bettering our economy as a community. And so all of those things, work together to be able to really bring value to the community's economy, to the community's governance, to how then we're also giving back. Because within that worldview, within Indigenous way of knowing, there is this reciprocity that what we're taking from Mother Earth, we're giving thanks for, and we're giving back. And so there's real opportunity I see. And when I seen Jeff's slides, they're so amazing, because I think there are these points of tension. But how do we acknowledge those points of tension and then work to harmonize, to really build better relationship in how we're developing these missions? And I see reconciliation as an opportunity for us to, create that space for Indigenous voice within our institutions, within research, within our organizations, within general society. How by creating that voice, we're also learning from another way of knowing and acknowledging that Western way of knowing is a way of knowing. it's not the way of knowing. So we have to acknowledge that there's other ways of knowing that need to come into this idea of co-creation. And by doing that work and creating that space, I think that's when we work to really reconcile. Because when Indigenous people within Canada see that their knowledge and their voice is part of solution, that's when they, jump on board. And that's when that benefits society and economy at large. So I think there's real value in us kind of working to understand each other, working to understand our knowledge systems differently, working to respect what we bring to the table, and how that feeds into developing, meaningful and effective relationships. So I'm going to leave it at that and turn it back over to you, Monica. Miigwech.
Jessica, that was phenomenal. It was sort of goosebump time over here. I was taking notes furiously. There were so many words that you brought forward. If there had been kind of a word cloud while you were presenting, words like holistic, interconnected, reciprocity, harmonize, learning, understanding. But I think the word that really, for me, struck a major chord was value. That, at the end of the day, this needs to bring value. And I'm hopeful that we can come back to that. Thank you again so much for sharing your perspective. Really, to use that word again, very valuable. So our next speaker is. Hang on a sec here. I'm a little bit lost in all of my papers. I want to make sure I get this right. I'm so sorry, folks. Okay, our next speaker is Marcus Extavor. My apologies, folks. So we wanted to invite somebody to bring us, and Marcus can do far more than this, but somebody who could bring us a private sector perspective. Marcus is Vice President of Energy and Climate at the X Prize Foundation, but anybody who knows him knows that Marcus has been in many different settings in academia, in policy spaces, both here in Canada and the United States and beyond. But we wanted really to have that perspective from somebody who could speak to innovation from a variety of different perspectives, but particularly from that private sector perspective. So Marcus, we're really looking forward to your thoughts.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I'm glad to see a good, healthy audience online. I really look forward to questions and discussion later. And let me just say again, it's a thrill to be participating in CSPC again, and specifically in this conversation. All right, so what I'm going to do is try to just make a couple of points to add to the conversation. I will play sort of somewhat a caricature of a private sector person, but really what I'm going to try to do is reflect on how I have come to see the innovation conversation and the mission conversation from my seat in the private sector, and I'll explain how that is. And it's somewhat cautionary tale and somewhat just a view that I hope will be productive as we go forward. So as Monica graciously mentioned, I work at X Prize Foundation, and I bring this up because this is an organization, nonprofit or not-for-profit, as we might say, that is explicitly focused on the idea of grand challenges and missions. So this is sort of the founding. Our motto is something like solving the Earth's grand challenges for the benefit of all of humanity. We're private in the sense that we are relentless in our pursuit of not monetary value, but I would say impact. This is a phrase, it's a slippery word, but it's a phrase that we use often. Is a program that we are running having impact on a particular problem? And what we try to do is we follow this process by identifying what is the grand challenge, which is very much aligned with the mission-oriented research agenda. What is the grand challenge? Can we identify it? What specific changes need to be made, either blockages unblocked or new avenues opened, in order for us as a collective community to pursue that grand challenge? Could we break the problem down further and say, here are some specific goals? They could be social goals, they could be policy goals, they could be technological goals. And then going one step further, stop me if you're recognizing kind of a design thinking pattern here. Then we say, okay, well, could we design a program to intervene and achieve one of these goals or multiple goals? And that's sort of how we think. So And I think that's very much aligned with the mission-oriented way of approaching innovation. The private sector, I think this in the private sector because, well, a lot of for-profit organizations and some nonprofits are very much focused on goals and timelines and schedules and measurable results. And these are either music to your ears or cold words, depending on your perspective, but I think it's helpful. And these are some of the benefits that mission-oriented thinking can bring, not just to the public sector and to the citizenry, but also to the private sector. So that's a bit of background. So a couple points I want to make. One, I really think the mission-oriented approach can work very well, but I think it hinges crucially on the ability to actually develop a cohesive roadmap. And this is actually the hard part. For me, I think it's the magical opportunity, because this is the opportunity to bring in different voices. This is the opportunity to bring in different stakeholders. Whereas some of our missions from the past, for instance, the moon landing, were quite technological, very specific. You know, I don't want to take anything away from the feat of landing on the moon, but land on the moon is a very clear and narrow goal. You know, that's not a critique, but it's quite specific. And that's in contrast to things like working on infant mortality, or ending homelessness, or houselessness, or working on climate change, which are giant, multi-sectoral, social problems that aren't just purely technological. So in this, it creates an opportunity, this mission approach, to bring a lot of different stakeholders together to agree on what the mission actually is, and then make that roadmap together. Now, this doesn't just mean we all will hold hands and this happens magically, but I think it's an opportunity. I'll say as a cautionary note, this is quite difficult to do. I think we'll reap huge benefits if we can do it in a lot of different problem areas or challenge areas, but it's hard to do. One example I would say is the COP process. So I work mostly in climate and energy innovation, and the COP process arguably is a giant exercise in trying to articulate what a mission could be. And don't hate me for saying this, but I would say arguably it is still in a place where we are trying to agree on what the problem even is, never mind whose role, who has to do what in order to solve it. But I think it is, you know, we're making progress, don't get me wrong, but it's an indication that it's actually quite difficult. It's actually quite difficult to get a lot of different actors, the citizenry of all types, private sector of different types, the public sector, basic researchers, applied researchers, and everyone in between to come together. But again, the mission concept is an opportunity. Second point I want to make, I come from a basic science background, okay? I started out sort of slightly more applied, studying engineering, and then went more basic. And I followed, just as an individual, my curiosity. I worked on that stuff because I thought it was cool. That's still a guiding principle of my career. I work in climate change because I think it's intellectually interesting, and I have the privilege to be able to do that. And a lot of people work this way. Now, so I really respect fundamental research. I worked in a lab working on stuff that I just never thought would see the light of day, but I was surrounded by people that thought it was interesting, and we did it. And, you know, maybe in a couple of decades, things like quantum computing that I worked on will become sort of tangible and meaningful for the average person. Maybe, we'll see. I think we're at a time where, you know, the most infuriating question you get as a basic research person is, how are you going to use that? Or why are we doing this? I think a mission approach allows us to sort of answer the why question. It doesn't yoke everyone into a sole focus on the mission, but I think what it does is reveal how basic science is crucial to the mission and how it's crucial to other aspects of innovation. I very much perceive that we're in an era where the role of specifically in innovation, I think Matsukato is trying to correct this to some extent, but the average person that you may have an innovation conversation with at a party, assuming, you know, just work with me, imagine there's a party where you're actually talking about innovation, would say that startups or the private sector or Google or Facebook or Boeing are driving innovators, and they might not say National Science Foundation, or they might not say NSERC. So I think we're in a time when the role of the public sector in basic research is being forgotten, and I think this is actually a huge risk for all of us. Last point I want to make is that, and this is a bit of my paranoia showing, but I see this very much from my private sector perspective. So I'm going to articulate how I would theme the last couple of decades of innovation conversation, very high level and oversimplification. In the 90s, we talked about productivity, and we obsessed about productivity. I feel like every third editorial in the Globe and Mail in Canada was about productivity and Canada's productivity gap. In the 2000s, we loved to talk about interdisciplinary collaboration. certainly at university campus, I was an active researcher at that time, that was a thing. Starting a new institute, it's got to have multiple departments. And I thought this was, interesting. In the 2010s, entrepreneurship. If you're not working in a startup, you're doing it wrong. Everyone should be an entrepreneur. We should have entrepreneur classes at universities. Every student should focus on entrepreneurs. And now we're in, I'm not sure what to call our current decade, but maybe I would say focusing on virtual brands. I don't mean the metaverse. I don't just mean social media, but the idea that an individual is a brand and an individual can create content and be an enabler. What I think all these things have in common is they actually sort of speak to the desire to have an organizing mission. And these are different attempts to try to get at that. But specifically the entrepreneurship piece. So back to my original point, in this post-truth world, the community with arguably the most to lose as a profession are the scientists. Scientists are held in wide regard in many different countries. Public polling data shows that scientists are still largely trusted. But the more that basic science and just the role of scientific research fades from the public discourse, the more people answer that question, how are we going to use this, and it goes unanswered, I think science's privileged place may erode. And this will be a disaster for all of us. For me, a mission approach is an opportunity to bring the role of scientific research into its place alongside economic considerations, social considerations, social justice considerations, political, business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I fully support what was said earlier as I close, that this dichotomy between curiosity-driven and mission doesn't need to be so. They can be symbiotic. And I think if we can get this stakeholder consultative, defining the roadmap stage right of a mission, we have an opportunity to actually not just protect the scientific enterprise, but build stronger collabs going forward. Couple ways of thinking about it from my perspective, and I'll hand my time back to Monica. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I love that snapshot of the last few decades of innovation. Lots to chew on there, and this idea that there is, sort of implicitly a desire to identify a mission, but that sometimes what's missing, to your first and last point, is the roadmap. I think that's really a really crucial point. So we have one final respondent. And what I'd like to encourage our attendees to do at this stage is to start thinking about some good questions. We were going to do a moderated discussion, but what I want us to do is to move straight into live Q&A with the audience. So start thinking up your questions for the group. But before we get to that, we'll hear from our last respondent, Dr. Brenda Kenny. And Brenda is the chair of the board of directors of Alberta Innovates and has worked in leadership positions in multiple science-based and innovation organizations, both nationally and provincially in Canada. She's also worked in the private sector and in the regulatory space, particularly when it comes to energy and climate change, and is very thoughtful on these issues that we're talking about today. So Brenda, we're so delighted that you were able to join us. And I'd also like to just note that you serve on the advisory committee for the ISSP, and we're very grateful for your contributions to our work. Brenda, over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here, and I am thoroughly enjoying this panel and really looking forward to the questions that'll follow, because this is such a crucial space. Some of what I'll say will probably feel a bit like a capstone from this previous discussion, because I want to focus on a few key things about how crucial mission-oriented innovation is. How fundamentally important it is to understand that it is complex. It's not just complicated, in which case we could see everything that we needed to think about in advance, just plan well. It's not like that. I'm an engineer. I love planning, but there is a challenge, and that means fundamentally we need to adapt and anticipate. And finally, the role of governments in this. We've heard a lot about urgency already, and I really want to stress the importance of urgency in galvanizing action around a mission. We have lived through this in the last couple in Jeff's presentation, I think some other presentations earlier in this week about the experience with COVID. And, what a great a terrible event, but a great illustration of what happens when you've got years of peer research, a robust network of scientists, commercial capacity to execute quickly and well, and those health networks to receive. And it's amazing when you think about it that a year into the pandemic, we had viable vaccines, and 2 years on, we are having increasingly widespread deployment of those. That's a remarkable example of what mission-oriented times can lead to. And you need those extraordinary times of urgency to create that. And I think that clearly, as has been said, we are facing just that now. But it's not just on one thing right now. We have climate, we have a massive health and social challenges, we have digital transformation. And dare I say, in Canada, let's not forget the critical economic change and transformation that is underway. So this leads us then to complexity, which is that it is hard to solve technically, but it's also a lot of unknowns. As you start down this path and say, in 10 years, I want to be here, you don't always know what that path is going to entail. So I agree with Marcus about the roadmap. The only thing I would highlight is that roadmap is often something we don't necessarily see clearly at the outset. So we need to be able to move into it. We need to be able to silo bust, be innovative in our approaches, and recognize on the as we move up those technology readiness levels, TRLs, from 1 at peer research to 10 as full-scale deployment, you're going to see some changes in how we even think about what is innovation. I know a number of startup and mid-sized companies will even IP is not just a technical undertaking, but you can have patents on know-how. So understanding that know-how is a part of the complexion of that innovation is important. So it's not just in the lab. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. So that does need a need to anticipate this road mapping. And I always have, throughout my career, thought about the analogy of a vessel in a foggy sea. You never lose sight of what port you're heading to and the clarity of that mission, but you may only see the next few navigation beacons. So carry on and have robust governance that allows you to cycle back, adapt, re-attenuate your course. But the mission is going to drive you forward. That said, we really do need a capacity to accelerate. We do not have the luxury of patience on many of these startling and grave risks, and similarly opportunities. And for Canada, if we don't take our place aggressively, we are now in a very global context in terms of science and innovation and the follow-on impacts on our economy and the regenerative ability to then reinvest in the future. One small example, I'm meeting you here from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, the home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Tsuut'ina, Itseli Nakota, and Region 3 for Métis. Here we're living, and I did not grow up here, so I have a pan-Canadian view on this, but I will just point to the fact that we've had an opportunity in Canada to enjoy considerable revenue from the energy system in terms of resources here, to the tune of about $200 billion from Alberta to the rest of Canada between 2007 and 2017. That's a huge bequest toward our future economy in Canada, and we need to be able to replace that quickly. So accelerating, anticipating. I'll just close with an understanding of the importance of government, and that includes the situational assessment of these other things around us, the geopolitical risk, supply of essential materials, energy and water security, price, inflation risk, and that sort of thing, and these talent wars. Government needs to be able to create, as Monica said, that alignment. They shouldn't be in the business of business, but they can be very clear about what that mission is. We had a clerk of the Privy Council federally, Kevin Lynch, between 2006 and 2009. And Kevin had this great quote: governments routinely overestimate what they can accomplish in the short term and severely underestimate their impact in the long term. I think now is a time for governments to own that accountability of long term. And I know that the political pressures force us to look short term, but we need governments to inspire and to create that within these very rapid cycles of innovation. One thing I want, many comments that'll come through, I'm sure, in questions, but the one final thing I wanted to point to, a number of people talked about trust. Jessica talked about ways of knowing. And I just want to point to the importance of that. There was an old management rubric from Peter Drucker that says culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And culture in innovation is crucial because it does kill off acceleration, strategy, focus, accomplishment. We need those things, as others, including Reese, have pointed to. And there is in the innovation space a really interesting idea of a social contract. I'd invite you to look up rainforest social contract, and you will see an explicit set of values and principles that innovators and an ecosystem approach is expected to live by. It has been the backbone of success in Silicon Valley, and it is a fully adopted part of the Alberta ecosystem, and I'm sure many others. So look for that rainforest social contract and the importance of us all to step up to the plate on our own role in that culture so that we can be successful. I'll close there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brenda. I mean, on the one hand, people listening could say, okay, she brings up complex, she brings up the challenge, she brings up culture eats strategy for breakfast, but you offered so many ways of addressing those issues. I particularly like this important idea about innovation and mission-driven innovation being, I'll use the term, kind of an iterative process. Already in the chat, there are a few folks who picked up on your metaphor about navigating in a foggy sea, and people really appreciating that. So we're going to move into the Q&A now. We'd like to, and I see that already people are starting to throw some questions into the Q&A, but before we get to that, if we could bring up, we have 2 more live polls for you. If we could bring up the first one, please. So this is something that I think our panelists have responded to indirectly, but maybe not as directly as they could have, and I might push them a little bit to get there in this portion of the session. So the question is, how well is Canada positioned for mission-driven research? Extremely well. The building blocks are there, but something is missing. The concept needs further debate and consideration. And finally, Canada should avoid a greater role for mission-driven research. And I see so far, we're really seeing this second response taking the majority of answers, so that the building blocks are there, but something is missing. There's still, I'm going to maybe give it a little bit more time here, because we have quite a few folks attending, and I'd like to get up to at least a 50% response rate before we close it. But so far, certainly, we're not seeing anybody say that Canada should avoid a greater role for mission-driven research. So at least some level of consensus there among the group. So why don't we close the poll now? I think certainly that would be, the responses that we saw there would be in line with, I think, what we heard from the panelists today. And I'm going to call on them at some stage, hopefully, to give their answer to that question. And then the final poll, which has already been open, thank you very much for that, is what grand challenge is the highest priority for mission-driven research in Canada? And we're really seeing climate change, mitigation, adaptation taking the lead here in terms of these areas. But I think, and I suspect all of our panelists would say, these are all crucial. These are all crucial issues. One of the things certainly that came to my mind when Brenda was speaking, and when a number of the respondents were sharing their views, is the question of time. So we've talked a lot about urgency. We've talked a lot about where does basic or fundamental research fit in vis-a-vis more directed research. And I think certainly in the climate space, the emerging alignment around net zero by 2050, I think opens up some really interesting ways of thinking about time. So where does more directed versus more non-directed research fit in the shorter term, let's say now to 2030 versus the longer term now to 2050. So let's close off that poll and move ourselves into the Q&A. I know there's lots of questions that have already been posed. I'm just going to start grabbing some of them here. And for those in the audience, please feel free to upvote questions so we've got a sense of which questions people are seeing as the most relevant. I'm going to ask the first question that's listed here because it's one that I wanted to ask the group. And the question is, what constitutes a challenge? What makes it grand or mission worthy? What are some of the criteria? Of course, your folks are upvoting things and the order is changing. What are some of the criteria we need to think about when it comes to reaching consensus of what is a collective challenge that's worth investing in? And, given that we have a limited amount of time before the end, I'm just going to maybe call on a couple of panelists to respond to that rather than having all of you respond in turn. I see Marcus nodding his head quite vigorously to that. So Marcus, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, briefly. I really respect the question. I think arguing over what's a grand challenge is a complete waste of time. I've wasted much of my time doing this. I think we should save the fights for one level down. I would say pick the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. That's a great starting point. Or let me just rattle off a few. Climate change, systemic racism, settler indigenous reconciliation, child mortality, world peace, weaponized citizenry. These are cancer. These are easy, I think, grand challenges that everyone would agree are large problems. Maybe I'm starting a fight there. I think it's more important to focus our attention on, okay, well, how do we break that big problem into actual solvable chunks that we can organize around?
Great, thanks, Marcus. Maybe thoughts for one other panelist? Does anybody else want to jump in on that question? I think it's a crucial one. Yeah,
Monica?
Jeff.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. Yeah, I think the key is to figure out what the mission targets are that then address a grand challenge. I mean, as Marcus said, there's lots of grand challenges. The trickier part is figuring out how do you sort of define that mission so that it is a solvable chunk.
Great, thanks. Next question here, and again, it begins with a similar question, but I think the post-amble, if I could use that word, comes to a different place. So the beginning is what constitutes a mission, and then the questioner asks, we've talked a lot about examples of missions, but for a field like astronomy, our missions are always designed to further our knowledge of the universe. How does a field like astronomy compete in mission-driven research? So I think this gets straight into some of the tensions, Jeff, that you raised in your presentation and that a number of you commented on in your responses. Reese, maybe I'll go first to you with this.
Throw me on that bus. Of course, I think we've got all we need to know about astronomy. We need to learn about evolutionary biology now, of course. Look, I think actually astronomy and big physics community has done a remarkable job at rallying efforts around or directed missions, or whether they're basic research. I mean, I look at the Perimeter Institute as a great example, and others. And I would say that there are conversations that I've had with my colleagues in the evolutionary biology going, what are they doing about, how do they get so much money for theoretical physics and we can't get that money for evolutionary biology? So look, I mean, it shouldn't be about competition. It should be about cooperation anyway. When I start thinking about issues around the pandemic, for example, and predicting the next one, and there will be a next one, mark my words, there's so much we don't know. We're very, very poor in evolutionary biology. Predict. We're mainly a retrospective science rather than a prospective science. To do those predictions when it comes to things like pandemics and spillovers from wildlife into human populations, we need to be working with wildlife resource managers. We need to be working with economists, with anthropologists, with political scientists, and so on and so forth, to really do that. So I think we should stop talking competition and start thinking about cooperation.
Great. Thanks, Reese. There's a question here that is the one that I've wanted to ask. So we're going to go to that one. And the question or the comment is looking forward to, oh, and of course now something has jumped around. Here it is. Looking forward to hearing panelists' thoughts on what is missing in Canada to solve grand challenges. So in a way, it's what would your answers be to that poll that we just ran? How well is Canada positioned? We're extremely well positioned. Let's get on with it. Building blocks are there, but something is missing, which is where most people responded. Concept needs further debate and consideration. What are your thoughts? And I do actually want to hear, I think, very briefly from all of you on this from your perspectives. Brenda, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, great question. I think that the governance issues we've talked about are still not where they need to be. Governments by department are siloed, even though there's an ISAT or similar groups in different provinces. I do find that we still sort of bump along when it comes to, well, that's an environment problem or that's an energy problem or what have you. So I think we really need better ways to silo bust on this. And I think some of the some of the superclusters, SIFs, the research innovation networks like the Clean Resource Innovation Network I'm familiar with are opportunities to do that. But we really need to own the podium on that and understand fully these are interdisciplinary. Secondly is urgency. I think sometimes, and we've seen this in some of the SIFs and elsewhere, we may get a rallying around a mission-oriented approach. We may even get a successful coalition, but then getting the legs up and running is often slow. Sometimes doesn't happen at all. And I think that is something we just really need to solve. The other thing I want to just plant the seed on is, and the climate is a great example. So it's obviously of paramount importance to Canada. And I was just in Vancouver last week, and let me tell you, it's real. But I think as well as looking at the urgency of results in reducing emissions and adapting on the landscape, which are crucial, we also, particularly in Canada, need to address Canadian competitiveness. I remain very interested in what does our economy as a country in a global setting look like in 10, 20, 30 years, and how are we positioning these mission-oriented drives to not only scale up the execution of those solutions, but scale up our competitiveness. We have a very small market in a global problem. And I know of a lot of mid-stage startup companies who are very much at risk of getting scooped out of Canada. And that is of importance to this audience because that is income that bleeds out of our innovation system and out of our cash flow that can go back into pure science. We need to find a way not to be afraid of being competitive and making money, because that is how we fuel our ability to be stellar scientists by the end of this century.
So what I hear there is silo busting, urgency, but let's take an integrated approach and not lose from sight in other issues, notably competitiveness.
And that means, to be clear, when we go through those TRLs, we are weak right now in scale up. We've got lots of programs for seed money and some for the big stuff, but that scale up is weak and we're not well orchestrating.
So let's hear from a few other panelists on this. Jessica, what would your answer to that question be? What's missing for Canada?
Well, I think systems change, right? When we think about colonialism, which exists here in Canada, oftentimes I think we get stuck in the space that colonialism is a thing of the past. It's a part of our history. It's an element of time, when in fact it's a system that was set up for a certain group of people to succeed in how Canada has evolved. And so if we understand that it as a system, how do we challenge those systems? How do we break down those systems to apply different ways of knowing, to apply different priorities into those conversations and look at them through a different lens? And within Anishinaabe worldview, we have these 7 sacred teachings of love, trust, honesty, humility, bravery, respect, and wisdom. And there's a reason why love is first. Because when we approach everything with love, first, usually we have the right intentions going into it. And sometimes I feel like in some of our mission-driven research, we go right to wisdom. And there's a reason why wisdom is last, actually, within our teachings, is that you have to apply love, trust, honesty, humility, bravery, respect before you can achieve wisdom. So I think if we look at system change and lean on other ways of knowing to help shape those systems and challenge the status quo of how we're approaching things, and then really get into the how and the why we're doing this, I think then society, starts to evolve as well in their way of thinking and getting on board with how this kind of shapes then who we are within the country we call Canada today, and how that that quantitative change is important, but the qualitative to me is where we're kind of missing the road, I guess, a little bit. So that's what I would like to add.
Yeah, no, and it it's almost like reframing, changing our paradigm of how we think about these issues. So I'm conscious of time here, and maybe what I'll do is try to work in a few additional questions as we move forward. And again, panelists, feel free to work in your answer to the question that both Brenda and Jessica just responded to. There's a question here around the granting councils. Maybe I'll bring this one to you, Jeff. So it says, but Canada has plenty of granting agency. What are they missing or not doing? Or is our problem linking government policy to research results? Perhaps insufficient evidence-based policy. Lots of threads to pull on there, Jeff.
Yeah. So again, I think there's kind of a couple ways to approach that. On the one hand, given the quadrant approach that I sketched out, I think we could have a mission-driven research and innovation discussion that completely is separate from the granting councils, which tend to be down in that lower left quadrant. And I did that specifically to say you can have a mission-based approach that's not going to threaten the basic research support from the granting councils. Having said that, ideally, I think you bring the granting councils into this conversation. You include their support as part of a mission-directed approach. Protecting the absolute need for curiosity-based research. But if you look around most of the other countries, there's often kind of it's rarely explicit, but there's often kind of a rule of thumb that there's kind of a 1/3, 2/3 split between support for fundamental research versus more applied research. So as long as you're and you can obviously debate what the appropriate percentage should be, but if as a society we decide that that, let's say, 1/3 of Canada's R&D investment should be protected for that fundamental curiosity-based research, that still gives you then a lot of room to play with the other 2/3. So while I'd like to see the granting councils be very central to this conversation, I'm also willing to say, what, let's focus on the other part of the system.
Great, thanks. Another question here picks up on something that Brenda said, but I'm actually going to ask a different panelist to respond to the question. So it's the Culture Eats strategy for breakfast line, and then the question. And I think I'll bring this to you, Reese, because you talked about some, and some very interesting, those graphs around R&D spending, international collaborations, levels of trust, and the like, which I think at some level do speak to culture. And so the question is, in the light of that, what interventions are needed to evolve our collective culture to support the collective effort? What's your sense from where you sit, Reese?
Thanks for that. I think we need to take I'm strongly influenced by the last 19 months. For obvious reasons, I've talked a lot about that already, and that's partly because I'm has direct how I do my research and what research I do. And I would say that we we've been in wartime with the pandemic. There is no question, and it's remarkable what happens in war in terms of the community around a series of problems. The old divisions, the old arguments is this, should we support astronomy or biology, or should it be federal government or private sector or something? Who effing cares? You got to get out of this. So the urgency part of this is really the priority for me. I don't have any great suggestions as to how to, and one could argue that you can't be in war all the time. I mean, hopefully it's the time. You can't have that sense of urgency 100% of the time. So I think sort of circling back to some of Jeff's comments, the granting agencies are constantly bleeding across boundaries in Jeff's 4 quadrants, right? It's like to applied, and that's reflecting their ability to position themselves to the Treasury Board and the government of the day, and whatever. Like let's just have a proper conversation. Let's not just always look to the federal government. There has to be private sector can be important. The NGO sector can be important, and we need to light that fire. And I think when we do, as the pandemic has shown us, a lot of those what are actually false boundaries and false barriers kind of fall away. Climate change is paramount. There are many others. We make decisions. We're not a huge Canada as a country needs to focus rather than fish, but we also need to make sure that we've got the basis of those ideas that come from basic research that we can pull when we need them in a time of war.
Great, thanks, Rhys. Maybe just one final question, and perhaps I'll put this one to Marcus. And the question is about the federal government's commitment to create a CARPA. And the question is, can a CARPA function without whole of government grand challenges? Does DARPA only work because the U.S. is fixated on defense?
DARPA works because everybody else gets out of the way. They created another one called ARPA-E, which was a carve-out of the Department of Energy, which, to put it bluntly, was hands-off. This is not going to be usual Department of Energy. We're going to do it our own way. So it's actually the independence. I don't question the obsession with militarization of the United States. Obviously, that's there. But I think that's not the key to DARPA's success. It's focus and independence. So I think a hypothetical CARPA, I'm not ready to say let's shred the shreds, Jeff, but I'm just going with you for a second. Let's say there is a CARPA. I think the key to its success will be focus and independence. And I think that still allows our granting councils to operate independently, even provincial bodies to operate independently. But if there's something that can pull across the system, but again, independence and focus, I think those will be the keys to success.
And no question here. There are a lot of unanswered questions as we conclude the panel. But I think I'd like to thank all of you for what I think is a success in terms of raising many of the really crucial questions that will need to be addressed going forward. So just for those who are tuning in, I would like to let you know that we intend to twist the rubber arms, hopefully rubber, of each of our panelists to write a blog for us at the ISSP in the light of their remarks here and the entire session. To keep that conversation going, we hope that this spawned greater interest and engagement around exactly these topics. So before closing off, I couldn't do that without saying some thanks. The first is certainly to thank the CSPC for enabling us to host this panel. I'd also like to thank the University of Ottawa, the Office of the Vice President Research, for enabling us to hijack one of their plenary sessions for purposes of this topic. I'd like to thank Jeff Kinder for being my partner in crime to organize this session. And there were many, many busy folks at the ISSP and at the IOG supporting the organization of the panel. Rhonda Moore, Brendan Frank, Raphael Desordi, and others at the OVPR. So many thanks to all of them. And of course, thank you to our panelists, without whom we could not have held this session this afternoon. I think they did a tremendous job of bringing forward the key issues. And then finally, thank you to all of you in the audience for attending and for all of your comments in the discussion board. I think we're going to take some of those with us and use them to inform next steps going forward. Thank you very much to all, and have a lovely rest of your day.